Greg is president of Reason IO. He's an adjunct professor of philosophy and humanities at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design and co-host of the Wisdom for Life radio show. His popular YouTube channel has nearly 3,000 videos and has drawn 14 million total views. That's very impressive, Greg, and we're all going to want to know how you pulled that off. Everybody wants 14 million views, so we'll bug you about that a little bit later. He is a member of the Modern Stoicism team and edited Stoicism Today from 2016 to 2022. He recently finished the half-hour Hegel project, providing line-by-line commentary on the phenomenology of spirit. And to me, that's even more impressive than 14 million views on YouTube, but you can understand Hegel that well. We want to learn more from you about him. After serving in the U.S. Army as a combat engineer, Greg earned a BA in mathematics and philosophy from Lakeland University, then an MA and PhD in philosophy from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. He's been a faculty fellow at Notre Dame University's Erasmus Institute, a visiting scholar at the European Graduate School, a Charles Chestnut Library Fellow, and recently completed the LEAP Institute for Nonprofit Leaders. His publications include a book, 2 edited volumes, dozens of academic articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, and numerous pieces written for popular audiences. Greg's philosophical counseling and consulting work focuses on the emotions, ethics, leadership, and specifically on anger management. His past and present clients include corporate executives and leaders, CEOs of smaller and startup companies, psychotherapists, psychologists, medical professionals, professors, lifelong learners, and students. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Lou. That's quite an introduction. And actually, I should mention, so the latest publication is in the Journal of the APPA, Philosophical Practice. So I'm really happy about that. And it does have to do with anger management. And it comes from the great conference that we had this summer. Thanks for inviting me for that as well. So,
well, you're more than welcome. That was a warm-up for this event, really, in a sense. And the article is, of course, there now in perpetuity, as long as electrons last. It'll be up there in soft copy. But it is also an article on anger management, of course, which is one of your specialties. So those of you who subscribe, I know that Patricia has already read it. You're always a quick study, Patricia, and she's enjoyed it. So those of you who have subscribed have received it. Yep. The hard copy is actually at the printer, so that will be mailed out in due course. But thank you very much both for participating in our annual meeting, which was very successful, and also for contributing the article, which we much appreciate. So I would like to ask you some questions. Your introduction. Sure. Actually poses some questions to me, and I would love to hear your responses, and then we'll open the mic. We have in this Agora, which is intended initially, the design was really for the public. But it turns out we have more practitioners here than anyone. But those of you who are attending for the first time, welcome. Welcome to APA's Agora. This is meant to be a free public event, and everybody's welcome, including, of course, philosophers. And we have some very experienced practitioners in the house who may want to ask you questions as well. So let me go back to something earlier. Your BA was mathematics and philosophy. What connections did you see between, I'm assuming you explored some connections there, and what was the basis of that?
Yeah, I did. And it's interesting when I think back on it. I think a lot of us, when we're younger, we go through phases where we think that like there's something that'll be like the single way to do philosophy right for the first time. And, there's others before us, like Descartes went through a similar phase, with his early works. He was enamored of mathematics and everything can be mathematized. And it's good to like go through phases like that and thoroughly plumb that, to be able to see that it doesn't work, right? There's stuff that cannot be quantified or dealt with using mathematical models. There's paradoxes that arise. So they were 2 tracks that worked well together at the place where I was. because the logic class counted as a math class, and it's not as if the math and the philosophy professors were hostile to each other, which you might find at some places, or they might just not engage each other. It was a small school. And, actually, if you don't mind indulging me for just 1 second, I'll tell you a story about why I became a math major in the first place. So, like I imagine many of you, when you took mathematics in middle school and high school, it was presented in kind of a boring way. I hated our geometry class, which was just mind-numbingly boring. And I was one of those kids who was good at math, but I'd be like, what am I ever going to do with this, right? And so I actually, was a combat engineer. There's mathematics involved in demolition, and I found that really fun, but it was kind of low-level stuff. And then I got into college, and I declared a philosophy major right away because my mom's boyfriend had said, hey, declare a major, then you're not just Joe Freshman, you're not going to get lost, you're in with a group. And I thought philosophy sounded cool, and so I did that. But the person who was putting me into classes put me into Calculus 1. And I was like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I mean, I know I'm good at math, but this is going to be boring, just like all my other math classes have been. And we started out the very first day, the guy who taught it was super into theory. So he said, okay, so calculus is based on the theory of limits. Here's some, he doesn't say, here's some metaphysics, but here's the idea behind it. And then he goes and he starts, doing things on the board. And I was like, this is mathematics? No, this is more like philosophy. This is really interesting stuff. So I went up to him after class and asked him some questions, and he was totally happy because students didn't ask him questions about this sort of thing. They just wanted to know what the proper techniques are and all that. And so his eyes lit up, and we start talking about infinity and whether positive infinity and negative infinity like coincide. And, so I'm really getting into it. And if I hadn't had that sort of person coming along at the right time, maybe I wouldn't have majored in mathematics, because the way I ended up doing it was I took Calc 1 and then I was like, oh, this is good. I'll take Calc 2. And then you've got a couple more classes. Then you're like, well, maybe I should minor in this. Maybe I should major in this. And so it's like a gateway drug, you could say. And so I wound up, being interested in like the foundations of mathematics and what logic could be used for, how we could model things, what the limitations of what we call formal systems actually are. And so it was good to go through that. And to get past it, I would say, and to become aware of the limitations of whatever it is that we're going to base primarily on mathematics. So, I'm not a skeptic about the use of statistics, for example, in argumentation, but, I want to, if I see somebody making a claim, I want to know, okay, what's your sample? Where did you get it from? What questions did you ask? All those sorts of things, So I found it very useful. I actually considered going on to graduate school in mathematics instead of doing philosophy, but I liked philosophy better. So that's how I ended up going the route that I went. I also considered doing the actuarial exams, which would have been at that time a great idea, because actuary was considered one of the best professions you could do in terms of stress, money, all that kind of stuff. But now the actuaries are getting phased out by AI. So maybe it wouldn't have been such a great idea to do, right?
Right. Well, our turn will come, no doubt. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, Greg, and we're gonna
for philosophers.
Yeah. Well, as soon as AI gets good enough to to compete with some of our professors, and it's probably getting close in some cases, the university administrators will not be slow to replace us. So I'm quite sure. I'm saying this to you tongue in cheek. What you probably don't know, and I'm sure a lot of our participants don't know, that I also did a degree in mathematical physics.
No, I didn't know that. Yeah.
No, I know. That's why I'm telling you, we've been on the same page there for quite a while. And this goes back to Plato and Pythagoras.
Yeah.
There are ancient roots for this. The harmony of the universe, the vibrations of the universe, all these fundamental metaphysical concepts really get tricked out that way. But I love geometry, and I got tired of solving differential equations at some point. I was doing an MA in mathematical physics, and that's all it was. It was just solving.
Yeah.
The power of solving problems is a great thing. And then the
Yeah.
idea is, how do we transpose problem solving into these value laden spaces, right? That's the real art for us. So
Yeah.
it's great that you basically got this very rigorous foundation and that you've been able to build so much on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you think about value, there's a lot of people who want to reduce value down to something that could be quantified. And I mean, in some respects, you can do that, like with cost benefit analysis and business ethics. There's certain things that you can do that with, and you got to kind of make up values, like what's a human life worth, what's the loss of a limb worth. It's always a little ad hoc. But then there's all these other things where a quantitative approach to it is just not going to work. Where we need something that's more based in the humanities and what that offers. You know.
Oh, well, absolutely. And so let me ask you this, though. You were also a combat engineer in the U.S. Army, and more
Yeah.
problem solving of a very practical kind. Did the Army train you in engineering?
Not in what we normally think of as engineering. So combat engineers, think of them as one step up from infantry and given a lot more tools and technology and smaller groups, and they're expected to go out in front of the other troops and do things like lay minefields, blow up obstacles, put up, fences, and, maybe make bridges or things like that. So it's a combat arms thing. And I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, but this is actually quite true. Combat arms people in the military, not usually the brightest bunch. If you can't qualify to be something like finance or supply or something, then they put you in infantry or armor or artillery. So actually you do learn a lot of problem solving matters in how to get people who are not particularly bright or motivated to get things done. You know, it was a lot of fun in many respects, blowing things up, pretending to go out on training exercises and stuff like that. But there were a lot of things where you're like, how did somebody like how could they be so thoughtless as to do this or this or this, right? And so learning how to deal with that sort of stuff without letting it get you all upset, that was quite helpful in terms of life lessons. And I will say this too, I had no intention of ever going to college. And if I had gone to college straight out of high school, I probably would have like flunked out because I would have been partying and not taking it seriously. I actually in high school, I at graduation was called up to receive a special award. And when it got handed to me, it was kind of a backhanded compliment. It was for succeeding despite the odds. It was like a little plaque, and a law firm in town had set aside $700, I guess, every year for this sort of thing. So they handed it to me, and I spent it on tuition for my karate school that I was going to at the time. And then I sent them a letter saying, I'm not going to college. I'm just working in a restaurant doing that. And then I went in the army, and the army gave me, some discipline and capacity for like learning how to deal with other people's nonsense. And so then when I went to college, I was able to do pretty good. But if I hadn't gone through that, I probably would be still working in restaurants today.
Yes, and part of our attrition rate, and a lot of people aren't working in restaurants anymore post-pandemic, but our
Yeah,
attrition
yeah,
rate in the U.S. is higher than it would be if people did, especially the boys, I would say, because they mature more slowly, if at all. But they generally at age 18 are not mature enough to
yeah,
come out of high
yeah,
school and tackle a university curriculum. And there are plenty of European countries that compel them to do military service, whether these countries are actually involved in ongoing conflict or not. Greece does, Finland does, I think Norway might still do it, Israel obviously
yeah.
does it. But the thing is that what they find empirically, and it won't surprise you or me, but they are much more serious at 22 than they were at 18, and they're much better equipped to handle and complete a college curriculum at that stage.
Yeah, I mean, even if you didn't do something military oriented and you did just like work in restaurants or in you know, some other enterprise, you're probably going to be by the time that you're 22, hopefully better equipped to handle what's involved in college education. And it is kind of a shame that we push it so hard. Oh, you've got to go to college. You got to go to college. That's the only way to succeed. Because I don't know about you, but in some of the places where I've taught that are fed by college prep schools, a lot of these kids get there and they're smart, they're courteous, they're diligent, but they seem kind of lost, and they've picked a major that they're not really that interested in studying because they heard it would be good for them, and it's usually like business, one of the ones under that, or communications or psychology or something along those lines, you know.
Sure. Well, the iron law of the invisible hand kicks in at some point as well. In the UK, they have never been ashamed of what they call red brick polytechnics, where
Yeah.
people who really weren't cut out necessarily for an erudite kind of scholarly career could still learn some very valuable skills that would benefit themselves and society. And there was no shame at all involved in it. And we are
Yeah.
coming around in America to rediscovering that we need more skilled tradespeople than ever before. And so the equivalent is what we call a vocational school, basically. But these trades never become extinct. And in fact, the economy now dictates that we have a shortage of them. So I think that this kind of vacuum is bound to be filled. But also, there's something to be said about the slower maturation process. Mathematicians and philosophers tend to have two very creative periods. One early in their even late teens and early 20s, where they get phenomenal work done if that bent. And then there can be a sort of a hiatus, and then they can come back in their 50s or even later and have another burst of lasting creativity and contribution. So that makes sort of sense, that you went through this. What was your graduate work when you finally did go for the, as we call it, the trade union card, the PhD? What was your thesis about? What did you tackle?
I took a year off in between undergrad and graduate school because I had what they called senioritis at the time, and they still use that term now, where I was just kind of burnt out. And I worked for a living. I lived here in Milwaukee and worked as a security guard, which was great because that third shift I could do a lot of reading and I got a lot of exercise done. And I worked as a barista. And then I had no idea. I'm essentially first generation college, because although my dad was a tax attorney, he'd gone to UW-Madison. He died when I was 11, and most of my family are tradespeople, so nobody could give you any useful advice, right? So I didn't have any idea about where you should apply to or stuff like that. So I just sent out applications, and Southern Illinois got to me the quickest with the most money. And I was like, yeah, sounds good. I'll go down there, And it was a great department at the time. Unfortunately, due to the budget cutbacks in Illinois since the financial crisis, the department is just gutted. It was about 14 professors full-time when I was there, and it's down to 4 full-time people, which is not enough to sustain a graduate program, I think. And so I think they'll probably end up closing that. And it was nicely distributed. There were analytic philosophers, there were continental philosophers, it was also a place that had a great strength in classical American philosophy. And then there were a few history of philosophy people. And if you wanted to do more, classic stuff, there was a classics department where you could study Greek, and you could do your rhetoric with the English department, or speech communications and stuff like that. So I took as many classes as they would let me. And I did my master's thesis on Husserl. One of the professors was translating the passive synthesis lectures at the time. And so I did that, and I brought in, stuff about language from de Saussure and all that, and ended up basically just duplicating what Derrida had done in Speech and Phenomena, because I hadn't read that book. So that was kind of valueless as far as like publishing anything, because it had already been done, but it was a good practice for me. And then for my dissertation, I was originally going to write on Hegel and this guy, Maurice Blondel, who's often called the French or the Catholic Hegel, dialectical philosopher. And my committee said, it's a little bit too ambitious. Why don't you just write on Blondel? You really like the guy. Nobody else writes on him. So I did. And I wound up with this sprawling thing that I never ended up doing more than publishing a little, section of. I would say that a lot of my mentoring was essentially benign neglect. They would say, you seem like you know what you're doing. Just keep going that route, And it was good for me because I would read whatever I wanted. I had facility with languages, so I could, go back to original texts, and I would work on stuff that other people considered not trendy enough, but I thought was interesting. But as a career move, not a great idea, right? So,
But how did you get attracted to phenomenology? I mean, you're doing hardcore mathematics, and
well, where I was an undergrad, and again, funny story, right? Our philosophy professors were essentially way past their prime, and they hadn't kept up on any contemporary literature. So they thought that there were basically four main important movements in philosophy going on at the time, one of which was analytic philosophy, which they thought was going to die out in a couple decades or so. Clearly wrong. They thought Marxism was important. It was at the time, right? Still in the early 90s. And then existentialism, which overlaps considerably with phenomenology, and then process philosophy. So that's what they kind of put forward as like, this is the cutting edge stuff. And if it wasn't for having like friends who actually read more contemporary stuff, I probably would have been really left behind. So, I got through the existentialism stuff, I got introduced to phenomenology. And then, you get to grad school and you take graduate level classes. And so the guy, Anthony Steinbach, who I think he's back in SUNY now somewhere, he was the one who was translating the passive synthesis stuff. He was a Husserl scholar, and we took a class on it. And I was like, yeah, I could do something with this. Although actually, now that I remember it, I was originally trying to do my master's thesis on Wittgenstein. And there was a great Wittgenstein scholar there, Donna Summerfield, who she, was pretty well known in the field, and she'd studied with people who'd studied with Wittgenstein. She unfortunately died quite young of cancer, cutting her career, short, like in middle age. And I couldn't get her to quite understand what it was that I was trying to do with Wittgenstein. She'd just give me this like blank look and say, I just don't understand what you're saying. And I was interested in this question about like, well, Wittgenstein has this notion of language games and forms of life. What is the nature of language games that we can conceptualize this notion of language games within it? So it's a recursive problem, right? And she would just like give me this blank stare, and maybe I wasn't explaining it well enough, or maybe she just had a block or something. So I abandoned it and then wrote on Husserl instead, So you had to write on something, right?
Well, yes, but again, very surprising choices given that you're from, sounds like, mainstream American tradition. Madison, by the way, is a fabulous town. I don't know if many of our participants know of it or have been there. I've been to Madison, and they had a wonderful NPR. One of the best NPRs was out of there, as you know. Yeah. And also, they told me when I arrived in Madison for a visit that by statute, the university was built within a very short distance of the legislature. I think it's within 5 miles. And there was a law in Wisconsin that the government would never be more than a certain distance from the so-called brain trust of the state. And I thought that was quite enlightened of them. It's nothing like New York. Yeah. We have our capital in Albany. They couldn't be further from Manhattan unless Buffalo. But seriously, this signaled some kind of a sobriety that was quite surprising and uplifting.
Well, we have two interesting traditions here in Wisconsin that unfortunately have kind of fallen by the wayside. It was originally one of the hardcore abolitionist states. There's one of our governors, Randall Alexander, actually threatened at the time of Lincoln's election that if Lincoln wasn't elected, he was going to withdraw Wisconsin from the Union. So what do they call that? Withdrawing the state. Secession. Yeah. It wasn't just a Southern thing. It was also a Northern thing, but it was because they didn't want to collaborate with the, slaveocracy, which was viewed as dominating, unfortunately at that time, the United States. So we've got that long, a tradition of equality, and we also, in significant part because of the German heritage. It wasn't just any old German heritage. It was Germans who fled after the failed revolutions in 1848. We had a strong socialist strain to Wisconsin politics. And it plays out in things like, for example, in the city of Milwaukee, compared to Chicago, per capita, we have 4 times as much green space as they do, because it was felt that, poor people deserve to experience nature in the dirty city. And so we needed lots and lots of parks. And so there's all sorts of aspects like that of Wisconsin. And so it doesn't surprise me that there was this, the legislature, we got to keep an eye on those guys. They need to be accessible to the rest of us. This sort of egalitarianism and thinking about larger society. Unfortunately, not as big a part of Wisconsin politics now as it used to be, but yeah.
Sure. Well, the older we get, the better we used to be. You know that saying. It might have collective applications. But another impressive thing, and then we'll get back to philosophy, but I've always been a fan of the Green Bay Packers. And my father was a great football fan. He loved the Packers. He loved that Vince Lombardi wanted to go to a place which had a losing record and forge them into winners. He did not want to take over a winning team. He wanted to take a team from the bottom to the top, which he did with his philosophy of football, which is also a philosophy of life. I mean, he was a remarkable man. But the notable thing, and I don't know if it's still true, is that the Green Bay Packers were the only NFL team that was publicly owned, right? I mean, it's not a private owner.
We own stock in them. Yeah.
Some oligarch, an oligarch with a whole bunch of teams on the string. But Green Bay, it's public, isn't it?
It is, although your Packer stock doesn't, you pay about, I think we paid $250 a share. And it entitles you to go to meetings and stuff like that, but not much more than that. Where the real action is season tickets, which you get into this pool. Like, we are expected, we applied for it when we first got here. It's expected another 8 years we should be able to purchase season tickets because they're so highly sought after. But there is this ethos. It's interesting with the Packers. Everywhere that we've gone during the season, if we're at a conference, there is a Packer bar somewhere. So like in New York City, it's Kettle of Fish, and you can go there. And my wife she's been to that. I've been to ones in Boston and other places. And the curious thing is you get all these New Yorkers and they come in, and they're often dressed quite nicely. And as the game is beginning, they're talking with the kind of typical New York accent, right, that they've picked up. And then by halftime, they're with the Wisconsin Yatter Hay sort of accent. Oh yeah, look at that, and they're eating cheese curds and all that sort of stuff. So, but it is interesting that you can go just about anywhere, and there are going to be some people who you can relate to as fans, and sometimes you actually have to get reservations because the bars will be so packed when they're winning. Now pretty easy because they're not having a great season, but
they've had plenty for a small community relative to the larger cities that football teams. It's really incredible. I think the tradition that carries on. And for our audience, if you're ever in Chicago and have a day or two, it's a pretty short drive to Madison. Milwaukee's a little further, as you know. But
no, it's about the same.
It's about the same. Well, I went to Madison from O'Hara. It was a short drive.
Yeah.
Hour, maybe hour and a half, whatever it was, couple of hours at the most. Yeah. So it's easy to reach if you're in the Midwest. And definitely recommended to spend some time there. It's a very interesting place. So, Greg, how did you move from all of this into philosophical practice? Was it sudden? Was it gradual? How did you become a practitioner of philosophy?
So I was doing some of the things that we call philosophical practice on kind of an ad hoc basis with colleagues before I went through the training and certification that I think it was 2014, the summer that you led that down in New York City. And I don't know if it's my wife who came across it first or if I came across it, But I was like, well, I'm already doing stuff like this and not getting paid for it at all. And I could probably do it better and up my game if I connect up with other people who are doing this and have like, a body of practice associated with it, right? So it's not just me kind of making it up as I go along. And that's what drew me to do the certification, which was very useful. And I will say this, so this is going to sound like I'm making a pitch for it. So the reading beforehand and preparation, and then the discussion of like, well, what is philosophical practice? How do you do it? That's very useful. But then the hands-on stuff, like, well, how do you actually establish a business? You need insurance, where are you going to get your clients from? How do you set your rates? Those sort of nuts and bolts things, very useful as well. And I don't think that I would have come up, and maybe I would have come up with that, but it probably would have taken me years, and I probably wouldn't have done it as well without, participating in those discussions, informed by you and Vaughna and other people who'd been doing it for decades. So, yeah.
But great, but this is a profession. If it is a profession, I think it is a profession without state recognition is probably a good thing. We don't want governments regulating philosophy. Not a good idea. Yeah. But nonetheless, it's a population of really self-identifying practitioners. People who've always, in one way or another, either thought about it or have done it. And again, there's no need to reinvent the wheels. We didn't reinvent all the wheels either, but we, as you well know, and we're preaching to the choir here because most of I'm looking at the participant list, and there are so many who've been through our program, and some of you who have not yet. I hope you will. But the point is that we had to blaze some trails, in order to turn philosophy. They don't teach this practical stuff in graduate school, nor should they necessarily. But it still has to be a threshold that gets crossed at some point. When you step out of the academy, you have to have some trappings and semblance of what it means to be a professional outside the academy. That's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. I mean, I know that having the certification has opened doors because people will be like, well, so what exactly are you? Are you a consultant? Are you a life coach? You can be, no, I'm a philosophical practitioner. Here's what we did. And then they can wrap their head around it. Whereas if I were just to like try to invent it all on my own, I don't think it would have worked as well. And it's interesting too, I'd be curious to hear from you about this, or any of the other people that want to chime in about this. So you do get pushback from colleagues who, when they find out that you do this kind of work, they don't like that. They're like, you're debasing philosophy. One actually used the word prostituting at one point. And I actually had a chair of a local philosophy department. I won't say which one it is because I don't want anyone like looking them up. I'll just say that they're since retired, who came up to me at a local conference, and I'd never talked to this person in my life. And he came up to me and he said, what you do isn't really philosophy. And then he just turned around and walked away. And I was like, what? And so there's some resentment that I think it provokes among traditional academic philosophers, and maybe that's based in fear, maybe that's based in worries about popularizing things. But I mean, you've been doing this for decades and decades. I imagine the resistance to it must have been a lot stronger earlier on. Is that right?
Certainly, we had, but exactly the same kind of pushback that anybody would expect to get externally from mostly the psychologists. Psychiatrists, are not so opposed to this. Because psychiatry, of course, is studying the organ that we think is, the place we live in. So yeah. they are the most the most philosophical of the medical specialties, obviously, and many of them are, including people like Urban Yalom. I've developed a friendship with him over the years, and he's very philosophical. In fact, I think he's a wannabe philosopher. If you look at the novels he's written about Spinoza and Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, it's obvious that he has some affinity for these thinkers, even though he's busy trying to diagnose them as either mentally ill or something else. That's a psychiatric training. But he's not an enemy of philosophy at all. Whereas many of our psychologists within APA are, of course, understanding of the origins of psychology, which are philosophy. And so they just want to get closer to the source. And they're our friends and allies. But initially, there was a lot of pushback. And it's not to be taken personally, because as I learned from some law firms that helped us navigate these waters, the psychology profession pushes back against a lot of initiatives that might look like they're poaching or encroaching on their turf. They want to monopolize the psyche as far as they're able. They have the power of licensure, and they proactively will interfere with and shut down anything that looks like a threat. That's unfortunate. But it's a turf war. There are rivers of money. Look, this is America. There are rivers of money flowing into the, into the healthcare system, and anyone who looks like they're going to fish in that tributary will be subject to the pushback from psychology primarily, but also internally, we've all experienced what you have, primarily from the analytic philosophers. Not so much from the applied ethicists, not so much from the activist branches of philosophy, but the pure analytic tradition, I believe, makes a fundamental mistake of regarding the part as the whole. They think that theoretical philosophy is all there is and all there should be. So there is this ressentiment or fear or anxiety of the unknown when they see. And so the accusation, you use the word, Greg, popularizer, they use it as a pejorative. Or they used to. But then you have phenomenally successful people who actually are helping them by popularizing philosophy. We attract more students into philosophy departments, and this benefits the analytic types, whether they realize it or not. We're actually helping them too.
This is a bit of a digression, but I have a short theory about like philosophy and justifying itself that I'd like to run past you, because it's drawn on my like personal impressions of what happened in the 70s and 80s. And obviously I was, too young to like be seeing what was happening in the field. But I kind of got the idea that a lot of philosophy departments, there was plenty of money flowing to universities at that time, whether they're state or private or whatever. And so philosophy departments and the kind of things that they were willing to consider philosophy, they could be elitist about it. They could be like, philosophy is for really smart people. You're not really smart enough. Why don't you go over there to psychology or business or, one of these other fields, the kind of stuff that we do, you wouldn't get it, And you look at this, a lot of the stuff that was being published at the time, and it's kind of along those lines. I remember getting a book at a used bookstore, and it was called What Philosophy Can Do. And the guy was making a case that basically conceptual analysis and all the rest of it is nonsense. That's what philosophers should be focused on. And that works fine so long as the money is flowing through, right? But as soon as you have to like make a case to people who are going to write your checks, who aren't, they haven't taken philosophy classes, you'd better be able to explain what it is that you're doing, first of all, and then what sort of positive impact you're having. And I think that's one reason why it became easy to cut departments and, reduce budgets, sometimes close departments, because there was this perception that philosophy doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of sitting around and pontificating, and it's essentially a waste of time. And I was somebody who's kind of, from an ordinary background. I mean, I can see that. I don't pay for services that I don't use. So why would they want, if we can't give a justification of how we're benefiting people through what we're teaching and how we're teaching them, why should they pay for us? So, was it like that in the 70s and 80s, that this sort of?
It was good for a long time.
Yeah.
Because philosophy was regarded as, even if it were useless ultimately or applicationless ultimately, it was regarded as a kind of mental gymnastic that at least could help people develop rigorous thinking and hand waving and other things. So, there was some, but the analytics school in particular did such a good job of making itself irrelevant and inaccessible that they are now paying the price. When humanities is being defunded, part of it is a broader ignorance on the part of the administrative class, unfortunately, and hubris. We need STEM, but we're losing what it means to be human because of the defunding of humanities. It's a great tragedy. So philosophy becomes more important in the end. And just as we are self-selecting, and all the practitioners in APA are people who are self-selecting, they had visions of themselves and were already practicing before APA was formed. And we just find that as an organization, we have more credibility, we have more support, we have more strength. Obviously, there are still independents out there who do well. But just as that's happening, our clientele is self-selecting too. People are not as dumb as often they're characterized as being. And there are a lot of people who have looked at what's on offer to them and have realized it's not enough. It may be necessary at a given time to have a medical or a psychological or psychiatric intervention, or a legal one for that matter, but it's not enough. There's something else in life. And when people encounter that moment, when they actually need a philosopher, they suddenly become very grateful that we're there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out in what you're saying is, like, ordinary people, okay, some of them are pretty dumb, but there's plenty of, like, elite people who are pretty dumb too, in the sense of, like, they can't manage their life and they make silly decisions and they don't have good bases for it. But most people tend to be smarter than academics give them credit for, I think. And part of the problem is we wind up setting up this divide, and they feel like how are they going to get across it to access the things that, we academics or we elite or whatever you want to say have to offer them. And it is kind of cool with the internet, it hasn't completely changed everything the way that early adopters were wanting to say, oh, we're going to live in a totally different time, a different era. Because, we're still doing a lot of the same stuff, right? But it democratized access to information in really massively important ways. So, if you wanted to know something about, say, Aristotle in the past, it could actually be quite tough, if you didn't have a good library near you or you didn't know what to access. I mean, now you can go on, you can find great encyclopedia articles, you can find entire free texts, you can find all sorts of resources, videos, podcasts, you can find people who aren't working in academia who are interested, say, in Aristotle's rhetoric or Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and how it would apply to life, and they'll do a podcast on it. And you can listen to it, and maybe they're not getting things 100% right, but they don't have to. You can advance in dialectically engaging them and saying, well, here's where I think it's wrong. And so we're really living in an extraordinary era, I think, for the possibilities of ordinary people getting access to these, what were typically, really elite products,
Well, two questions for you before I open the mic,
Okay. Yeah.
Just one comment. Remember, Wittgenstein also talks about a disordering of the concepts. And a lot of our clients, notwithstanding the vast seas of information in which we're all drowning, they don't necessarily have a library catalog or its equivalent that helps them with a taxonomy. Where does all that, how do we sort this data? What is important? What is true? What is false? We encounter all these problems all over again. So having a good conceptual framework, I think, really abets a more efficient and optimal use of the vast amounts of data available to everybody. And that's where we play a role that nobody else plays, in helping people to get a handle on ordering their concepts and on clarifying their concepts. So with that, I want to ask you two questions. First of all, I guess what everybody wants to know, how do you get 14 million views on your YouTube channel? And secondly, could you give us an example of a kind of case that you think is in some way exemplary of your own kind of practice, be it a CEO client or be it a psychology client or be it whoever you like? Just give us a quick case study from your own practice, and then tell us how you became so phenomenally popular on YouTube. That's really interesting.
Well, I will say this: there are channels out there that make mine look like, a little tiny dwarf in comparison. They're not necessarily always great. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them are, if you make your stuff really high production and the videos are short and you don't go too deep, you're going to get way more views, right? Especially if you like to court controversy or like, can you believe what Aristotle said? That sort of approach. So, there's famous, and then there's YouTube famous, right? And YouTube famous is sort of like, a little bit lower, or actually a lot lower than being actually famous. Now, the 14 million views. So I've been doing YouTube videos for 12 years, I think, at this point. And, it increased exponentially. At first, the first maybe 2-3 years, I didn't have as many videos out. I wasn't getting quite as many views, but it takes off after a while. And I projected a consistent ethos, which I think is based in something real, that I'm not going to bullshit anybody. I'm not going to talk about the popular topic of the day just because it's popular. I'm just going to give you the straight dope as far as I understand it on these thinkers or texts that I'm teaching about. And I'm not overly critical. So like when I teach somebody I don't fundamentally agree with, like Kant or Hume, I present it, I present it sympathetically without saying, oh, and here's where Kant is wrong about this. I present it charitably. And so people know that they can go to me for accurate, competent exposition of stuff, and that I'm not going to spend a lot of time putting graphics in or, making beautiful sound stuff. It's going to just be like classroom teaching. So that appealed to people. And it's interesting because when I first started, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I'm not politically conservative, but I'm temperamentally conservative. I don't like a lot of change. And I'm very suspicious of, proposals to do big projects. So my wife is the early adopter, let's do this cool thing, sort of big picture kind of planner. And she was the one who convinced me to put videos online. She was like, she got me a flip cam and she's like, why don't you record your classroom sessions? And I was like, well, who the hell's going to want to watch me? I'm nobody, and, the lighting isn't good and the sound isn't good. And she's like, what do you have to lose? Just try it out. And I was like, well, okay, I guess I'll do it. Right. And I did that first at Fayetteville State University, just with these critical thinking classes, which they own, because at that time, YouTube, you couldn't upload more than like 10 minutes at a time. So we had to do it institutionally. And, the biggest catalyst for me was the comments that I got, because there were people who were saying, thanks for putting this out there. My professor won't explain anything. And I was going to flunk the class and this or that. Or I used to go to college. This is really nice. It's like being in college again. Or I can't afford to go to college. Thanks for putting these resources out there. So that told me that there was this, big, vast pool of people who are hungry for, it doesn't even have to be like perfect, just decently presented, competently thought out information about philosophy.
And what's your optimal length? Not too long, as you say, but also not too short. What you want some meat in there, right?
Yeah, it really depends on what you're trying to do. So it's interesting too, because the educational experts, I was starting out in the 2010s, and the educational experts were all convinced that a video cannot be longer than 5 minutes because these students, their attention span is so short, they won't watch anything. And they were also saying, oh, you can't just do talk and talk, and that's exactly what I did. So I'd put a whole class session out there and people would watch the whole thing, so the educational experts didn't know what they were talking about, or they hadn't done enough sampling. Right. And I found that some things I like to do these, what we call core concept videos, where they're anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes long, and I'll take like a whole text, like I'm working through Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics right now. And each main idea, I'll spend that amount of time and I put stuff on the chalkboard and I get up and I talk about that. So to finish that text, we're talking like maybe 35, 40 videos, and people will watch them. Some people will skip through it to find just the stuff that they want, although I think that's kind of tough to do. But then I'll do other videos that are 2 hours long, and people will watch those if they're interested. Like I do these videos about speculative fiction series, and they're supposed to end at 90 minutes, but often they wind up being 2 hours. And if your content is interesting enough, people will watch it. And like what we're doing here, this will be a video that I think people will watch probably in its entirety because they want to see what's happening next, right?
Well, let's see what's happening. What's happening next is, just before I open the mic, please give us a quick thumbnail of one of your
a case. Yeah.
cases. Yeah, let's hear about a case.
Yeah. So, one of the cases that I've been thinking a lot about, and I should start doing this, writing case studies.
Yes. And submit it to the journal because we want to publish it. But give us a little sampler, please.
So I had a guy, and I think there's lots of people out there like this, who came to me, and he was very upset because he had been listening to Sam Harris's podcast. And Sam Harris is, kind of a skeptic about free will and all of that. And this guy was having some serious emotional difficulties because he was like, well, what if Sam Harris is actually right about this? Then I'm basically just a mechanism. I think I have free will, but I'm clearly deluded and all that. And it took a couple sessions, but the gist of what I did with him was say, well, why do you think Sam Harris is correct about this? I mean, how did he possibly sample enough people to figure out that there couldn't possibly be any free choices out there? This is a rather dogmatic assertion. And so it's it falls within that scope of philosophical practice, examining assumptions and seeing where people are engaging in mistaken lines of reasoning, which then lead to really traumatic emotional results, right? And it was kind of like after a couple sessions, it took like I think 3 sessions. You could see like that kind of proverbial light bulb go off, and he's like, yeah, holy crap, why am I actually giving these people such credence on these massively sweeping metaphysical claims when I don't know where the hell they're getting this from, And this happens a lot with neuroscience. People, I like to say that neuroscience, because I'm not dismissing it, includes everything from really rigorous science to total quackery and pseudoscience and everything in between. Because there's a lot of people who think that, well, we'll just do some brain scans on 10 volunteers in a university setting in a very artificial experiment, and then we'll deduce some pretty massive things about the human emotions or decision-making processes. And you're like, well, this is terrible philosophy. Really? So anyway, I worked with him on that. And sometimes you got to, and I'd be interested to see what you have to say about this. Sometimes you got to kind of like, you can't approach the problem directly and say, here's your problem, buddy. Let's just do this. And it works. You got to kind of pick here and kind of, it's almost like unraveling a knot.
It's dialogue. This is what dialogue does. It unravels the knot for the client too. But I'm remembering Isaac Bashevis Singer's response to this, which is not resolving anything, but it's amusing. And he noted once that every time he crosses the street with a fatalist, he says the fatalist always waits for the light to change. So. So just a humorous observation about hard determinism.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, I'd like to open the floor, and please show your hands. Physically, I can't see everyone. We have lots of folks in the room, but if you'd like to raise your electronic hand, be happy to acknowledge you, and then you can engage with Greg. Okay, please go ahead. Anyone? Patricia, okay. Go ahead, Patricia. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Gregory. I really enjoyed a lot listening to you. I did it as well when you presented your speech in the EPA annual meeting. But of course, and you see, you are such a great example because your path is so heterogeneous. You pass from that really it's contemporary and it's a model. It's a model. I mean, it should be like that. Philosophy now should be like this, heterogeneous, coming from different experience at the first degree, a first basis, and then becoming philosophy. Because my personal opinion now, I'm developing this during my year of experience, is that every discipline in the end becomes philosophy. So you started from mathematics and physics, like Epicurus or Galileo, and then you arrive to philosophy, and then you arrive to the show, because you are speaking to people, unknown people, through technology, through internet. And so you are also a showman that speaks about philosophy, and I appreciate that a lot. And then another thing that I was thinking, listening to you, was then I always thought that to have the courage to go in YouTube and to show yourself in a video, knowing that many people are listening to you, in a way, yes, you have the responsibility to have a competence, of course, to be honest, like you are, sort of deontological principle. You are honest, you are describing Kant or Hegel or whatever in a very honest and simple way, and respecting the length of the video, and that's it. But I always thought that you need also to have a kind of theatrical. You have to be trained in theater as well, in communication. I mean, you have to be, you see, a sort of ability to be theatrical. Study theater could be useful, but then you said no, because you started just like a video camera with your wife, and then it was a success. So no rule at all. I mean, you can be a very theatrical man, or you can be a sort of shy professor of philosophy and being successful just reading perfectly, I don't know, Hegel or the phenomenology of spirit, or Kant or Wittgenstein or Merleau-Ponty, and you can be successful as well, because maybe the world is so wide that everybody of us can find a little target that, even if you are very shy or very extroverted and communicative, I think that if you are honest in the content, in what you say and what you think, you put together intellect and reason in a way, body and mind. I think that people can appreciate this. And so thanks a lot. This is
You're welcome.
my big thank.
So there's a lot of really interesting ideas there to respond to, and so I'm going to sort of work my way backwards.
Yeah, it's more comment than a question, actually, but
yeah, but yeah. It's great stuff for springboarding off of. So yeah, I didn't study theater, although interestingly, my oldest child is a theater major, finishing up her fourth year here. She wanted to be musical theater because she was very good at singing, but she ended up having to switch to straight theater because musical theater involves a lot of dancing, and she has an old ballet injury that interfered with that. But I've my approach was developed in part by years and years of teaching what we call service classes, which are, introduction to philosophy, ethics, logic, the things that are for undergraduates, where they're not majors, and oftentimes they have no idea why the hell they're in the class or what good this is possibly going to be to them. And I wasn't very good at the start. When I think about my original classes that I taught, but you get good after a while at reaching ordinary people. And so for me, that was very helpful. And I kind of think that that's a nice apprenticeship that a lot of academic philosophers strive not to have, but they're actually hurting themselves by not doing that. You do better when you have to teach people who are a harder audience. And one person I'll say too, Alistair McIntyre, when he was at Notre Dame University, he could have
Yeah.
not taught any classes at all, or he could have just taught graduate students. And he deliberately chose to teach undergraduates and not to teach philosophy classes, but to teach these service classes. And I really admired him for that. And I asked him, well, why did you do that? And he's like, these are the most important students. You know, it's easy to teach philosophy students. Teaching these other students, this is the one chance we have to reach them and get them to appreciate this field. But I think that, you know, there could be a lot of ways in YouTube that somebody who has a different temperament or different experiences could teach philosophy well. Maybe if they are more shy, they don't have to be as theatrical, right? They don't have to. I'm an outgoing person, so that's kind of natural to me. But there's some people who are more introverted. You know, there's a woman who goes by the moniker Dr. Logic, and she's got a whole bunch of really great videos on logic. And I instead of shooting my own, I refer people to hers because I don't want to do that work, and she's doing it. And she's not as, you know, she's not as animated and all that, but she does really good work. So I think there could be like a whole multiplicity.
Honestly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you do have to know what you're talking about. I think people pretty quickly, if you don't know what you're talking about, people are going to figure that out pretty quickly,
Yeah.
right? Now, there was one other thing I wanted to respond to, but I can't quite recall what it was, because you had such a lot of good points in there. Maybe it'll come back to me over time.
Let's give it a chance to come back, and then we'll come back to Patricia. But we have Ibrahim and Rick with their hands raised. So let's go to Ibrahim. Hello, Ibrahim. How are you? Please jump in and engage with Greg.
Thank you very much. I am glad to have you here. Gregory, I am a philosopher from Istanbul, Turkey, and I began to teach philosophical counseling when I read Lou's book in Turkish. Now his other works is also translated. I also translated some of his works into Turkish. It's gonna be published. And really, I just when I look at your I know your YouTubes, and I said, oh my gosh, the classical philosophers, if they see this, they will be jealous of Gregory. Some of them, they don't have a chance, to reach people, and they just posthumously they become famous. I just wonder what is the major problems and cases people ask to you, and second, because through the internet and social media, because I am also following you, you reach a lot of people. And I am just started in Turkish, but I am just surprised when I saw Turks in Europe, from Europe to Australia. They teach me, they reach me, they ask questions. I never imagined this. So there's so many people, they have problems, and they don't want to talk as psychologists. But the outreach of your viewers, I just wonder this. And also, I agree with you as Sam Harris, and a guy who read Richard Dawkins' books. He just has an existential problem, and he was at the verge of the suicide, because if he said if everything is meaningless and everything is chaotic, etc., there is no point in the life. Then I suggest him. I introduced him to Dr. Viktor Frankl. Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
Yes, I also want to hear from you on this things. Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's striking, the range of people that have problems that maybe a psychologist can help them with, but maybe sometimes the psychologists want to take an approach that isn't all that helpful for them. And then we have resources within the vast field of philosophy. I mean, we've got 2,500 years of stuff to draw on, and just in the West that we can mine for insights. We're so lucky with that. And we can direct people to what's helpful. And my clientele has been kind of a mixed bag. I've done some executive coaching, with C-suite executives, and very often they know exactly what they want to work on, but sometimes they've they're actually wrong about that, as we find out talking about things, down to like people who are just working in a grocery store and they're having trouble with anger management. They're fighting with their spouse, or blowing up at people at work, and they want to do some techniques. So it's a wide spectrum. I like Frankl, and actually as you were talking about the problem of meaninglessness, another person I was thinking of who I did some videos on recently is Marcus Aurelius, who, officially he's a Stoic, right? So he's got a party line, you could say, but he says it like 4 or 5 different places in the Meditations. It could be Stoic providence, which I believe, could be Epicurean atoms, in which case it's all just kind of random nonsense, there's no providence. That none of that keeps me from living a good life and being a good person. And I love that, because we have, in the modern Stoic movement, very broadly speaking, there are the people who call themselves traditional Stoics, and they think the other modern Stoics are a bunch of heretics because they've taken, the logos and providence and all that out of the picture. So they're not really Stoics. They're just exploiting it. And when one of the main Stoics says, hey, even if none of this stuff is true, I can still use these techniques, these insights to quit being such a jerk to people and to have a harmonious life, even though I've got this incredible responsibility on my shoulders. That's a good model for us, Frankl, I mean, way, way worse circumstances, right? So yeah, that's quite cool. And I'm happy to hear that you've been translating works into Turkish. We live in this now incredibly connected world where English has become a lingua franca, but it is like super, super important that important things get translated back and forth, we're fortunate in that there's plenty of translation out of other languages into English, maybe not as much as we'd like, but for people, a language is like a home for people, right? So to have works in your native language is so important for people to be able to relate to them, and doing good translation. I'm a translator myself, and I've become very gentle with other translators because I realize that my own translation's far from perfect.
What do you translate from? Which languages do you translate from, Gregory?
Mostly Latin and French, occasionally German. When I write on Aristotle or Epictetus, I'm providing my own translations from Greek as well. But most of my published translations have been from French or Latin.
And where did you pick up French?
Well, my mother's family is French Canadian, although my mother grew up in Chicago, and so she was francophone and grew up in a little part of Chicago, which was all French Canadians and Menominee Indians. She was a 4th generation American, but she grew up, not learning English until she was 5. And so my generation, I was one of the few kids in my generation who actually learned some half-assed French. And then she made me take French classes when I was in 8th grade and 10th grade, and I screwed off because I could afford to. And then when I was in college, they put me, my first year, they were trying this new program. And if you were in the language houses, you would get a single room. You didn't have to have a roommate. So they're like, you speak French, right? And I was like, yeah, I guess so. So they put you in, they had a German house, a French house, a Spanish house, and a Japanese house. And the idea behind it was an experimental thing. There would be a native speaker living in one of the rooms, and you would do cultural things with them and chat, in the language. So the other people who were in there, one was a Hmong guy who spoke French, and then the other was a guy who was supposed to be learning French, who didn't actually learn a lick of French. And we would chat back and forth. And she liked me, so she would buy us, beer and liquor when we were underage, and we had a great time together, And then we were supposed to be studying French together, but we didn't. We just kind of BS'd around. And then when I finished college and I was like working in a gas station for a while before I took the security job, I had this textbook, and it was a textbook that was a French textbook in French. And I was like, maybe I should buckle down and actually learn decent French. So I did. And then, you do your learning your grammar and your vocabulary, and then you start reading people and translating and all that. So I was, reading Baudelaire or Sartre and people like that. And I could talk with my mom. And actually, this is totally off topic, but my mom was a super, super outgoing person. She unfortunately died when she was my current age, 53. So she had a great but short life. And she loved to talk smack about people. And so we would walk around, and the place that we live right now is above what used to be the Grand Avenue Mall. And so she would walk with me, and she'd be like, Gare le Gros there, look at that fat lady there, or check out that guy over there, how terribly he's dressed. And nobody could understand what she was saying, not even French speakers, because Canadian French is different than Parisian French, And so it was like a code that she would use. And that was part of my practice, And so, actually I'll say one other thing, and this will show you how silly my career has been. I got caught up in Quebecois nationalism in the 90s. And so studying French philosophy at Southern Illinois University was a way to stick it to those Anglos, so I was, studying people like Derrida or Maurice Blondel or, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and reading them in French. And it was partly to, I was young. I was kind of stupid at the time emotionally. It was a way to say, this part of the world used to be New France. Technically it was, this is all occupied territory, being French Canadian is more like being Latino or something, which it isn't. I mean, up in Canada it is, but it's not here in the United States. And I got really, worked up about the 95 referendum, and then afterwards I realized just how silly I was being about all of this stuff,
Well, I'm really glad. First of all, Ibrahim has ducked out of here, but thank you, Professor Ozdemir, for chiming in and for precipitating this thread. For those of you who don't know him, Ibrahim is a very distinguished professor in Turkey and is here at Clark on a
nice.
Yeah, he's a visiting fellow in the U.S. and I think may have another year. So he's also APPA certified and is a true pioneer. There's a method to his madness because he's translating seminal works into Turkish in order to disseminate the practice of philosophy in Turkey more widely as well. So you're doing a great job of being a pioneer. And we're really very grateful to you because Turkey is such an important country, on the hinge of Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
So, as well as probably in some ways the most modern of the Islamic nations, in many respects, the most secularized. So we really salute you, Ibrahim, and thank you so much for all of your work.
Yeah, just not on Turkey. There are a lot of students from, almost 300,000 students, internationals in Turkey. And I just find out, many of them, they are also taking our translation back to their country. So just like Gregory has 14 million viewers, you can't imagine the impact of anything you humbly done. Okay, I am trying my best. Also, Pierre Hadot is very well known in Turkey. Maybe you can say something as a you have been in France about Pierre Hadot. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Ibrahim. It's great to see you. We'll see. Turkey is new to philosophical practice, relatively speaking, and vice versa. I mean, in terms of its modern incarnation. So we'll see how it goes. But I have 3 books coming out in Turkish simultaneously in February. So I will speak with you more, Ibrahim, about that, and maybe we can arrange something, go back to Istanbul and do some kind of a book launch. But we'll talk about that a bit later, okay?
Just let me remind you, last week on the 26th of November, we have a panel discussion at the university in Turkey. They just asked me to summarize what is going on in here in North America and also Canada. I summarized all of your works and also about APA, what is APA is doing. And there was a big interest in this, and it is also publicized on the websites of the university. Yeah, I just want to share with you.
Well, again, thank you so much for your pioneering work, and I'm sure it's very impactful. You're being modest, but when you already have a large influence in the educational world in Turkey, so whatever you take on is going to be attended by people. So again, thank you. It's great to see this moving into this part of the world. It's very important. I think philosophical practice will do a lot of good, not only in Turkey, but also in neighboring countries. So thanks again, Ibrahim, for all your hard work. And we'll talk more, okay, as new things come to the forefront. I just wanted to say, before we get to Rick, who's very patient, thank you, Rick. I'll come to you momentarily. I promise. We still have loads of time. But I don't know, Gregory, if we mentioned this last time, you're telling me your mother was French Canadian. I grew up in French Canada.
Oh, yeah.
I guess you didn't know this. You didn't. My father's first language was French.
Okay.
My first language was English, but I'm fluently, as my mother was fond of saying, fluently belligerent in both tongues. And but I mean, you're so right. French Canadian was divorced. You know, when my dad was in Europe during World War II, he served with the Canadian Armed Forces, of course, and he spoke French in France. He spoke perfect Quebecois French, and they said to him in French, Monsieur, vous parlez le français du 18e siècle. You're speaking 18th century French. It was charming for them for about 10 minutes. You know,
my mom got called peasant in Paris, and she did not like that at all.
No, but she has the advantage in Paris of being also to be able to be unintelligible in French. If she wanted to trash talk the Parisians, they wouldn't understand her either.
That's true. Yeah.
Quebecois slang, you know, she could speak joao to them, and they wouldn't understand a word. They were cut off from France after 1763. Basically, when England won, they allowed the Quebec, you know, to maintain its Catholic religion and its French language. And it was, you know, the British had a democratic attitude, and they said, well, we'll let them keep their religion and their culture under British sovereignty. So there's this constant friction between the British and the French do not tend to get along very well at the best of times, you know. But the language was really kind of cut off from France, and so it's very colorful. They taught us Parisian French in school. It was useless in Quebec, and then vice versa. When you go to France, you better speak proper French. So very interesting. What part of Quebec was she from? Do you know?
My mom, she wasn't. She was a fourth generation American. But
do they know where they're probably parish?
Oh yeah. So what ended up happening is my great grandfather fought in the American Civil War. So he crossed the border into Vermont, took a doctor's son's place for $500, which was a lot of money at that time. And then, you know, he survived the Civil War. And they lived in the Northeast for a long time, and they would just keep bringing people down from Quebec, sort of like how, you know, immigrant communities do today. And so my great-grandfather and great-grandmother moved the family to Chicago in the 1930s, and they had a bunch of kids. They all lived in like the same little district. It was called the Saint Jean Baptiste district after the church there. And it was all French Canadians and Menominee Indians, because there's more Menominee in Chicago than there are in the reservation, and they speak French. And they, you know, like my grandfather's generation, so he married a Yubai from Quebec City. And actually, his brother married her sister too, and they all lived together in the same block. And so what they would do is they'd keep bringing in people, right? So there's this constant influx of French speakers until my mom's generation, and then they were kind of established. But that entire generation, they all spoke French as their first language, and so, you know, I grew up hearing it all the time and picking up not just, you know, the good words, but also the swear words too. Some of the earliest words were like Kalias and Tabernac, and, you know, and things like that from my uncles. And so, it's kind of a weird thing. Is she what, she's an immigrant, but she's not an immigrant because she's a fourth generation, but her mom was, from Quebec and all that. So it gets very confusing
it's also
to
very
talk about it.
fantastic, and New England is riddled with, we call them Manqué. Maine, the state of Maine, all kinds of people are descended from Quebecois French people, and they are Americans several generations now, and they lost French, but they still have French names. Yes.
Yep.
So,
well, and that's the way most of the people in my family are. So Sadler is my dad's family name, and it's not the real family name. It was originally Skufka, but my grandfather changed it. My mother's family name is Lemries, and we're the Lemries with the missing S, because when my great-great-grandfather came over, he was illiterate, didn't know how to spell his name, so they registered him as Lemrise. And so there's all these Lemrises who don't speak French. And funnily enough, there's a big branch of the family that has a lot of Native American in it, so they're kind of swarthy and all that. They just tell everybody they're Mexican because it's easier to tell people that than to try to explain what Quebecois means and all that. So, yeah. I actually had an Iranian friend as well who would just tell people he was Mexican, because trying to explain to ordinary Americans what Iranian means, and he wasn't really Iranian, he was more Azerbaijani in his family. It was just too complicated, So, yeah.
Yeah, Mexico covers a lot of ground, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Rick, thanks for your patience. Please go ahead and unmute.
Sure.
Nice to see you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So first a comment, Greg, and then a question that I often ask people here on the Agora. The comment is, how ironic is it that neuroscientists are sending people to philosophical counselors with existential crises, people like Sam Harris or Dawkins, for instance. So scientists in general, no matter what. I have had 3 clients that have come to me specifically because Sam Harris gave them this kind of, this, where they thought their life was meaningless and all that.
Yeah.
So we can thank them for generating business for us, but it's kind of funny, but it's kind of sad that it's ironic and sad that our alleged, scientific voices are, sort of destroying people's mental health.
Yeah.
And we're the ones who have to pick them up and try to put them back on track. So I just wanted to share that with you. But the question is, so there's a kind of debate within philosophical counseling. I'm not sure if you've ever been pulled into it, but about methodless methods and what's your primary method as a philosophical counselor, or just like my question to you is, what's your philosophical toolkit generally consist of? And do you have a position on that method, no method kind of question?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we use a lot of ideas that we take from the thinkers who we like the most. So I draw pretty heavily on various traditions of virtue ethics coming from ancient and medieval philosophy and existentialist philosophy and some other things here and there. But then, is there like a general method? Not really, because I'm an eclectic when it comes down to it. So a client, if they're receptive to bibliotherapy, I'll say, well, let's actually read, this and talk about this, right? But maybe they're not. Maybe they just want, can you give me some practices to work on, and I'll do that. And Lou mentioned dialogue earlier. I see dialogue itself as an integral part of it. You talk to somebody rather than just the client laying out their problems and then you putting it, okay, you've checked this thing off, here's this technique. Instead we got to talk. We got to dig into what their situation is and what insights we can draw out, and that's kind of unpredictable. I've found, and I'd be interested to hear from others. I don't know that I've actually got something that I would call a method, because to me that implies a little bit more consistency than I think I actually display in my practice. which, might not be a good thing. Frankly, it might be better if I could like say, here is exactly what we're going to do. And then clients will sometimes ask me, okay, what are we going to do? And I'll be like, well, I know what works for you. So it's a little bit more pragmatic. But I'd be curious. I mean, do you have a method that you would say like, this is, I can write it down for you. Here's what we actually do in this, or anybody.
I'm pretty much like you. I'm on the no method and all methods and whatever seems appropriate kind of approach.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not like, I want to reject method or anything. I just don't have it available.
Right. To my attitude is, since the problems that come to us, if you made an analogy with them, one tool doesn't work for all problems.
Right.
If all you have is a hammer, you're going to treat everybody like a nail.
Yeah.
So the people that come to us they exhibit all sorts of different kinds of things. So what might be appropriate to come out of us, having access to a whole variety of tools, approaches, etc. And I think you're right that one thing that we all probably should emphasize is the process of the dialogue. Yeah. So if you want to call it a method, but even that, I mean, sometimes different things happen in sessions. So like you said, they might want to learn a certain practice. And so now you are a tutor or whatever.
Accountability partner. Yeah. What does anybody else is there anybody here who could say, yeah, I definitely have a method. Here's exactly what it is? No?
Sure. If Pierre were here, then he would definitely say that he has philosophical midwifery because he's the the greatest exponent of it, and it's definitely a method, and it applies to a huge range, of possible cases. So there are people who have methodologies that they really prefer to work with. But I think I'm also in Rick's camp and your camp in that it's a dance. The dialogue is a dance. And you never know what the dance is going to look like till your partner shows up and you start dancing, and then you kind of work it out. And it might be a kind of dance that no one's ever danced before. Usually it is one way or another. So we have favorite philosophers. I think I'd be on safer ground to ask you, who are your 5 most frequently cited philosophers if you're going to cite anyone. And I know Rick has his favorites and we all do. Patricia puts in the chat room that she thinks you're wise to let method grow out of the experience. So you got a compliment there from a very experienced practitioner. And that's a good thing. We have about 3 minutes. We generally wrap up at 5:30, and that's 3 minutes away. Would anyone who has not spoken like to ask the last question of the day to Greg? Is anyone out there wanting to ask or say something? If so, now's your opportunity. Please don't be shy. Not everyone at once, but
just hello to everybody. Just thank you for this lovely conversation and sharing. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome.
Prego, Stefania. I mean, it's getting late. You and Patrizia are in Italy. What time is it in Italy now? It must be getting late in the day.
It's 11:30 p.m.
Well, thank you for being here. I mean, that is quite a commitment on a Saturday night,
Well, Italy is a very important country for philosophical practice. I want to tell you, in case you didn't know, it's a very big deal. There are many practitioners, many schools, a lot of conferences, a lot of literature. We're all going to be there this summer, Stefania, in Rome for the World Congress, and in August, and we'll keep in touch with you. But we'll definitely get together for real. I mean, how else are we going to eat Italian food if we're not in Italy and drink some real coffee? So I'm looking forward to that. But thank you very much for joining us at this hour, and hope to see you again. The next Agora, we're going to not have one that, New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. It will be a little bit later in January, and the guest is a surprise. That's because it's not scheduled yet, but I have some really great practitioners to follow from our first year of doing this. We've had tremendous success in terms of the quality of our guests, of course, and they get a lot of views. Not yet 14 million, Greg, on the APA channel, but we're getting a lot of views, and we're attracting new participants into the audience and into our program. So it is having a modest success. I think it's a wonderful thing for us to get to know each other, and also to ultimately to get this up on the web so that people can get to meet the more personal side of the practitioners who are out there, and maybe gravitate toward them, as they discover that they're interesting people, which you certainly are. So congratulations on all your success, and I hope it carries forward for you. I'm sure it will.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're
and thanks for having me on. This is very enjoyable. And this is the first one that I've been able to get to, because usually I've got like different things going on Saturdays, but I'm definitely going to be there for later ones, because this is a great format.
Well, great. It's totally informal. Every guest is always worried, and they send, what do I have to prepare? And when I tell them nothing, nada, niente, just show up and we'll have a conversation for a change. We don't need to be academics for each other. We can be a little more real and just talk about ourselves and our experience, and share with others, the way that we practice. I think that's a very valuable thing, in addition to the more formal literature that we spawn. So thank you very much, Greg. Let's give can we make some kind of a round of applause, at least virtually? Everyone's clapping, Greg.